Happy New Year, everyone! To celebrate the occasion, here's my review of Dusk for PC. This is a first-person shooter by David Zemansky and New Blood Interactive that was released into early access in January of last year, with the full release following in December to generally very positive reviews across the board. It is of course a retro-inspired first-person shooter with the primary influences coming from the likes of Quake and Half-Life, but it does actually incorporate a wide variety of influences from a wide variety of sources, from of course classic first-person shooters to horror movies and so on. But since the game wears its influences on its sleeve, there's one major question that needs to be answered. Is this just another pale imitation of what came before, or is it something else entirely? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out. Well, before we get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, where, like I said before, the game definitely wears its influences on its sleeve. You will notice tons of references throughout the game, both to other first-person shooters, of course, but also in particular to horror movies, like, for example, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But the most glaringly obvious reference is in the visuals themselves, which are styled to look primarily like Quake. This means that all of the textures are deliberately low-res, all of the models are deliberately blocky, and all of the animations are deliberately simplistic. And while there are certainly some nice touches with some of the fog and smoke effects, as well as the lighting, ultimately you are dealing with a game that is deliberately styled to look like it might have come out 20 plus years ago, and that's going to be very hit or miss for you depending on how much emphasis you put on graphics. But regardless of whether or not you can put up with the retro styling, there is also the matter of how visceral they made the combat look, where you will blast enemies and large amounts of blood will spray out of them, and if you blast them with enough damage, then they will explode into meaty chunks, which is absolutely glorious. But aside from that, you're dealing with a retro-styled visuals that are also fairly bland as far as a lot of the environments go. I mean, you are dealing with a lot of industrial complexes and a lot of farmland and swampland for a large portion of the game, until it starts to get into the weirder stuff later on. And while it is obvious that that is all very lovingly crafted, it isn't exactly the most appealing to the eyes, at least until you start to get to the stuff that is really weird and interesting, which again is later on in the game. But while the visuals do certainly have a few issues here and there, they ultimately accomplish what they set out to do. It's just that a lot of that's going to depend on whether or not you're okay with the retro styling. But of course, the visuals are only half of the presentation. The rest of that is occupied by the sound design, where the first thing I have to mention is that there's not a whole lot of voice acting in this. I mean, there is, certainly, but it's mostly limited to a few clipped phrases that the cultists will say, for example, non-believer, and such like that. And of course, the taunting that you continually hear in your head, where you're not entirely sure where it's coming from. But regardless of which voice acting you're talking about, it's all very cheesy, and that ends up actually helping the game out a fair bit in the long run, because it contributes to this feeling of not really taking the game all that seriously. That's actually one of the bigger strengths of a lot of classic first-person shooters, this idea that you're not really supposed to take it seriously, you're just supposed to hop in and have fun. And Dusk having that cheesy voice acting really does help to contribute to that feeling. But then there's the rest of the sound design, which mostly concerns itself with trying to make the game as badass as possible. Although it does only have mixed success there, because while a lot of the gunfire sounds nice and beefy, the explosions themselves are fairly low impact and dull. So that's a bit disappointing, but then you move over into the soundtrack, which is done by Andrew Hulshult. He also did the soundtrack to the Rise of the Triad remake. And while that was primarily converting all the classic MIDI tunes of the original Rise of the Triad into a more modern, usually metal style, the soundtrack in Dusk is all new music, and it's all very heavily influenced by the soundtrack of Quake, which means that you have a lot of dark, moody, atmospheric tracks that give way to some very heavy industrial metal. And to say it kicks ass is an understatement. It manages to simultaneously convey this really dark and sinister atmosphere, but also make you feel like a complete badass going through all of the levels and just shredding anything in your path. And even though the sound effects themselves do have a few issues with regards to the explosions, when you combine the overall sound effects with the soundtrack, that feeling of badassery that the majority of sound design was going to accomplish ends up being accomplished. So overall, they've managed to do a very good job with the presentation, although again, your mileage may vary on the retro stylings of it. Although even if you don't appreciate the retro stylings, you'll probably at least get a kick out of how the visual options give you the ability to adjust how ridiculously pixelated the visuals are, or being able to increase the FOV to downright ridiculous levels like the maximum value, which is cynical, or being able to lower the frame rate cap down to 25 frames per second, which is listed as cinematic parentheses bad idea. Not to mention, of course, the variety of graphics options available to you, and the fact that the game runs buttery smooth across just about any system out there, which means that they really put a lot of effort into at least polishing up the PC version quite a lot. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. Although this being a retro-styled first-person shooter, there's really not a whole lot of story to speak of. You play as someone who is generally referred to as the Dusk dude, and you start the game off pulling yourself off of a meat hook and having to fight your way through the town of Dusk, which has been apparently overrun completely by psychos wielding chainsaws and wearing sacks over their heads, as well as this mysterious cult, as well as undead creatures and eldritch horrors. So the general gist is that you're trying to figure out what exactly is going on and stop it so you can get out of there. But of course, things do get a bit more complicated than that a bit later on in the game, even though again, there's not really much story there. It's mostly told through these various scrawlings on the walls that mostly detail the cultists' descent into madness and give you some very cryptic messages on how to proceed. And while the storyline is definitely not going to be winning any awards, it does help to give the game a bit of a mysterious vibe, and it all ends up being very Lovecraftian in a lot of ways, which is always nice to have. But with it only giving you very vague snippets here and there throughout the levels, and then at the end of episodes giving you a text blurb, or at the end of the third episode giving you a straight up mini cutscene, the writing does end up getting pushed into the background, and it ultimately falls to the gameplay to make or break this thing for you. So what exactly is on offer in terms of gameplay? Well, like I said, this is a retro-inspired first-person shooter, which means all of the hallmarks you would really expect from just about any of those. You don't have a 2-weapon limit, you have a full selection of weapons available to you, each of which mostly occupies an archetype. So for example, the Riveter is basically your rocket launcher, the hunting rifle is basically your railgun. There are of course pistols, shotguns, and machine guns, as well as a couple different types of melee weapon, and you do also get a grenade launcher that is called a mortar and has remote detonation capabilities. Among this list of archetypical weapons, you also have 2 weapons that are of an arcane variety and that spice things up a bit. The first of these is a sword, which has 2 additional bonus effects depending on your health and your morale. Now, your morale basically acts as your armor in this, and if your morale is at 50 or higher, then you can hold the aim button and actually block attacks and actually send them reflecting back at enemies. Now, every time you do block an attack, it does reduce your morale count by 1, so you need to keep that in mind and basically view it as a resource, whereas if you have health at 100 or higher, then you can hold the attack button down and charge up a melee strike for a lot of damage. And the other arcane weapon you get is a crossbow that shoots bolts that will pierce through multiple enemies. So you can use that to your advantage and line up a bunch of enemies and take the shot, and it will do damage to every single one of them that is in that line, which is very handy. But while the sword and the crossbow definitely stand out, the rest of the weapon selection is no slouch either, and every single weapon does have its place, with of course the shotguns and the machine guns being the main workhorses, while the rest of the weapons are more situational. And thankfully, especially when you pick up the super shotgun, the shotguns get pretty glorious. Because let's face it, a proper retro-styled first-person shooter needs really good shotguns, and Dusk thankfully has them. And of course, as is fitting, ammunition's pretty plentiful, so you can make full advantage of all of your weaponry. And when you move over into other mechanics, you find that it's more or less exactly what you would expect from a retro-styled first-person shooter. As I've said before, you have a morale rating, which is basically your armor rating in this, and you also have health. neither of which regenerate. You have to find objects in the environment that will give you various health and armor boosts, or in this case morale boosts. In the case of morale, you'll be finding things like gold coins, sacks of money, as well as diamonds and things like that, and you can also go and quaff beers in order to increase your morale by 1, but if you drink too many of those, then you will get drunk and it will start wobbling your aim all over the place, which actually can get pretty nauseating. The story is much the same for health, although it doesn't have the drunkenness feature to go along with it. Instead, you'll be collecting health through picking up various medical packs, as well as optionally eating canned food when you find it. And in proper retro first-person shooter fashion, these pickups are actually quite plentiful on all of the levels, although not so plentiful that you can just be completely flippant and take as much damage as you want. Particularly on the higher difficulties, you might take quite a lot of damage per individual hit, so you need to be very cognizant of how much health you have, how much morale you have, and whether or not there are any items left to pick up. And in keeping with the design principles of particularly much older first-person shooters, you also have the selection of 3 different types of key with each level. So you can find red keys, blue keys, and yellow keys, each of which will give you access to different areas of the level, and not all of which are necessarily required in order to be able to complete the level. Sometimes you'll pick up a key and it will never be required for you to get to the end of the level, and instead it's used to access different secret areas, which might give you weapons early, or might give you stashes of health, morale, and ammo pickups, or maybe you'll find a power-up, or it might even give you access to a different level entirely. That's right, not only does the game have secret areas, of which there are a lot of them, and a lot of them are very well hidden, but it also has secret levels you can miss out on entirely if you don't discover the secret entrance. And while the secret level in Episode 3 isn't great, the other 2 secret levels are actually quite good, so you'll probably want to complete them. And that means exploring every nook and cranny of all of the levels in order to find everything you need to be able to find the secret entrance. And if you decide to explore all the levels, you will find that the level design in Dusk is absolutely fantastic. It is some of the best first-person shooter level design we've seen since the 90s. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's definitely room for improvement. I mean, pretty much the entirety of Episode 2 is just okay. It's not great, but Episodes 1 and 3, on the other hand, are extremely well designed and feature a lot of environments that will actually basically fold in and around themselves in order for you to access new areas that you couldn't before, or, in some cases, they'll reuse parts of the level but do it in a very different way using certain mechanics that will actually make things a lot more interesting. And on top of that, when the game does introduce new mechanics to the player, it makes sure to give you some time to actually test it out and see how it works before requiring you to complete any challenges with it, which all shows some very clever design with a lot of thought put into it. Although you do end up with certain levels that basically follow a gimmick pattern more than anything else, and it ends up only introducing mechanics for that one specific level that never really get repeated anywhere else. So that's a bit of a shame, because those mechanics would have been interesting to see elsewhere, but unfortunately those mechanics are only used within the levels that they're introduced, and nowhere else in the game, which is ultimately why Episode 2 falters where Episodes 1 and 3 excel. But even though Episode 2 does end up being disappointing compared to Episodes 1 and 3, the other 2 episodes end up making up for that, so it ends up not being as big a deal as it might sound. And it really helps that the core gameplay loop is extremely well done. I mean, I've mentioned before about all of the retro-style aspects to it, but the single most important aspect of this retro-styled first-person shooter is the blisteringly fast movement. If you were used to bunny hopping your way through Quake, then you'll feel right at home here, because it's more or less the same style of movement. You can move really fast by using the bunny hopping technique and jumping at an angle as opposed to just jumping forward, of course. And you can build up a pretty ridiculous amount of momentum and dodge shots accordingly. There is not a single enemy in the game that has a hit scan weapon. They all have either melee weapons or projectile-based weapons, which means that you can in fact dodge anything that the enemy is throwing at you, which means that the harder difficulties are actually very manageable if you know how to maneuver and you're able to dodge the enemy's attacks. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Cero Miedo, which is the second highest difficulty, is really what the game is meant to be played on. Because in proper old school fashion, the highest difficulty, which is Dusk, is just completely unfair to the player, and the difficulties lower than that are actually quite a lot easier. Although I'll be fair here, if you haven't played old school first person shooters like Quake before, then you might actually have a hard time with it. Anyway, point is that the hard mode of the game is actually a proper hard mode. It's really the sweet spot difficulty, where it's not so overwhelming that it basically becomes impossible, but it does provide a good challenge nonetheless. Now that said, the difficulty is not 100% consistent. While you do gradually ramp up the difficulty of the enemies by introducing new types with either much faster projectiles, or that do a ridiculous amount of damage to you, or have area effect attacks, or any number of things like that, and those are all interesting and add different challenges to the game, you do also have the problem of, even though the game does have boss fights, none of those boss fights are really all that great. It basically just ends up being fighting a much larger and tougher version of enemies that you'll find in other places. In fact, in two particular boss fights, that's exactly what happens. They're basically just upscaled versions of regular enemies, and in other cases, they might have slightly different attack patterns or have very different damage outputs, but they are ultimately just very large enemies with a lot of health. And the only one that introduces any new mechanics and has you try something a bit different is the final boss of the game. But of course I'm not going to spoil that for you here. Suffice to say, the bosses in general end up being a bit disappointing, although they're certainly not unwelcome. And of course, going back to the level design for a moment, there are actually some secret areas that will lead to optional boss fights, where if you didn't find the secret area, then you would just skip that boss fight entirely, so that's actually pretty neat too. Of course, sometimes you can even skip a boss fight anyway by simply using a bar of soap. Which probably sounds pretty ridiculous, and it certainly is, but you'll find bars of soap in every single level in the game, and if you do manage to find them, because some of them are very well hidden, then you can use them to instantly destroy any enemy in the game. In fact, that does lead me to mention that there is one particular feature that is very much not a retro feature, and that is being able to pick up just about anything in the game and throw it at enemies, whether that be a saw blade, or a barrel, or a rock, or even a bar of soap. So when you bring it all together, you have a game that is not really meant to be taken all that seriously. You just hop in and you just have a ridiculous fun time playing an old school style first person shooter with blisteringly fast movement, absolutely fantastic level design, excellent gunplay with some incredibly fun to use weapons. And while the second episode certainly falters a bit, the boss fights are a bit disappointing, and the enemy AI is certainly pretty dumb. I mean, it either charges directly at you, or it moves towards you while occasionally throwing projectiles at you. Dusk manages to do what so many retro throwback games don't, which is not only pay homage to those classic games that it's based on, but it manages to put itself right alongside them. And that is a very rare and very welcome thing to see. I mean, it's definitely not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I already mentioned some of the issues with the main campaign, but there's also two additional modes which I didn't really bother with all that much. The first of them is the Endless mode, where you basically just fight off endless waves of enemies, and the second is the multiplayer, which is only deathmatch. And while it's certainly nice that the game has a multiplayer mode, it ultimately is rather limited as to what you can do with it, and it's only for very small scale games anyway. And then of course the Endless mode is really just exactly what it sounds like. I mean, you're just fighting off endless waves of enemies, and that does grow a bit tedious because it's not what the game is really good at. I mean, fighting off waves of enemies is well and good if that's your kind of thing, but this game really excels when you're exploring the levels, finding all the different secrets, experiencing the atmosphere, because there's actually quite a few levels in the game where it manages to generate a very tense atmosphere that ends up being actually quite surprising, but anyway. Point is that the single player campaign is where it's at with Dusk, and even if you only take it on that, it is well worth the price of admission. but as a whole package, Dusk is definitely flawed, but for fans of old school first-person shooters, this is exactly what we've been looking for years and have not been getting. It's a game that fully understands what made old school first-person shooters great and doubles down on that, and it pays off a massive amount in the long run. So much so, in fact, that I give it a 4.5 out of 5. Like I said, there's certainly room for improvement here, and I do hope that if they ever make a sequel to this, that they improve upon some of the issues that were present in Dusk, and maybe expand upon some things, maybe add in a voiced protagonist instead of a silent one, or have consistently fantastic level design as opposed to having a great episode 1 and 3 and a just okay episode 2, or things like that. But again, for fans of old school first-person shooters who have been waiting a really long time for a really good first-person shooter, we finally have one. Once again, folks, Happy New Year. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.